My name is Michael and I work in the intensive care unit at a local hospital. It was never an easy career choice, but it's something I love and, frankly, have always felt like my calling. The work is grueling, emotionally demanding, but incredibly rewarding when you save someone's life. I met my girlfriend, Jessica, 2 years ago. She worked as a graphic designer for a large company. We met through friends, and we immediately hit it off. Jessica is charming, intelligent, and has an incredible sense of humor. She was the person who made my hard days easier and my life brighter. Our relationship developed rapidly. We moved in together 6 months after we met, and I thought I had met the one and only woman I was ready to spend my life with. We had plans, to buy a house, get a dog, maybe even have children. But somewhere deep down, I started to notice changes. Jessica became more distant, she was often late for work, and her phone became an unreachable zone. I blamed it all on stress, as her company was going through a tough time. We all need space sometimes, I told myself as she sat in her bedroom for hours, ostensibly working on projects. But doubts began to creep in. Sometimes she would put her phone away too quickly when I entered the room, or give short, curt answers when I asked about her day. Once I even joked, "What, are you working with a new creative director again, Jess?" She laughed, but her laugh was nervous. I didn't know then how far things had gone. My relationship with Jessica seemed stable at first glance. We still went on dates, laughed at our favorite TV shows, and spent weekends together. But there were small cracks that gradually became more and more noticeable. I began to think that her attention was becoming selective. For example, when we were having dinner together, she would suddenly turn to her phone. "I'm just answering a colleague," she would explain, without looking up from the screen. But I noticed that every time I passed by, she would turn her phone slightly so that the screen was facing down. At first I brushed these thoughts aside. "This is nonsense, you're paranoid," I told myself. I was sure that our relationship was strong enough to overcome any difficulties. However, the small details began to add up to a more disturbing picture. One such moment occurred during a dinner with our friends. Jessica suddenly became more active in conversation than usual, but not with me. She was talking about new ideas and projects at work, and she mentioned someone named Steve. And although I didn't attach any importance to it at the time, later the name, Steve, itself began to send a slight chill down my spine. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Jessica suddenly started staying late after work, saying they had a series of important projects coming up. I tried to be supportive, even bringing her coffee when she was working from home. But her laptop was always closed when I walked into the room. One Saturday she announced that she was planning to go to the gym. It was unusual, she didn't often go there alone. I offered to join her, but she declined. "I just need some time alone." This evening I was sitting at home and wondering why I had the feeling that a shadow had passed between us. To somehow distract myself, I started scrolling through my phone, but accidentally came across her page on social networks. Recently, she rarely posted photos of us together, instead sharing posts with quotes like, "Life is a search for yourself," or "We create happiness with our own hands." I tried to ignore it. I justified her changes as stress, overwork, even personal growth. But something new began to grow inside me, doubt. And it grew with each passing day until I decided I had to find out the truth. My doubts were growing, and it was starting to affect my behavior. I found myself watching Jessica more and more closely, her facial expressions, her tone of voice, the way she answered simple questions. Something had changed. Her smile had become strained, and her answers were more reserved. But most importantly, I hardly heard the word "we" from her anymore. There was more I and me in our conversations. It was a small thing, but I couldn't help but notice it. One day I decided to check her phone. I know it wasn't the best move, but my anxiety grew into real anxiety. That night, after she fell asleep, I carefully took her phone from the nightstand. It was locked. Jessica had never used a passcode before, but now it was there. It was another signal to me that something was wrong. I tried to calm down and put the phone back in its place, trying not to show that I was offended. But that night I barely slept. My head was swarming with thoughts, guesses, questions that I had no answers to. To distract myself a little, I started sorting through old things in the bedroom. In a drawer that we rarely opened, I found an envelope. When I opened it, I saw 2 theater tickets. Their date coincided with the Saturday when she supposedly went to the gym. Maybe she wanted to surprise me? I tried to calm myself down. But the tickets had 2 seats next to each other. And no one had offered me to go to the theater. Dozens of theories immediately popped into my head. Maybe she was going with a friend?
Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Thank you.
But why was she hiding it then? Or maybe with the same Steve? And why didn't she tell me about it? The next day I tried to ask her carefully. We were having breakfast, and I said something casual. If we have a free evening, maybe we should go to the theater? You haven't been there in a while. Jessica froze for a second, then smiled. Yeah, that would be cool. Her answer seemed normal, but I noticed, she didn't ask why I mentioned the theater. My suspicion only grew. A few days later, I received new evidence that added fuel to the fire. When I returned home earlier than usual, I saw her coat and scarf thrown on the floor in the hallway, even though Jessica always hung them in the closet. It was a small thing, but it looked like she was in a hurry. There was a cup of coffee still steaming on the kitchen table, but the apartment was quiet. I looked into the bedroom and saw Jessica talking on the phone. Her voice was excited. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but the tone seemed too intimate for a normal conversation with a colleague or friend. I decided to wait until she was done and pretended to have just arrived. "Oh, are you home yet?" she asked with unexpected ease as she left the room. "Yes, I got off early," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. She quickly changed the subject, started talking about something mundane, but I could no longer let go of the idea that she was hiding something. I hardly spoke that evening. A decision was forming in my head, albeit an unpleasant one. I had to find out the truth, even if it was painful. Conversations with Jessica were becoming increasingly tense. I tried to act calm, as I always did, but inside I was growing anxious. She began to avoid contact more than usual, spending time in the bathroom with her phone or explaining that she needed space. I couldn't stand this uncertainty anymore. One day, on my way home from work, I decided to take a detour. I called her best friend, Megan, with whom she often spoke. Megan was always nice to me and even called Jessica and me the dream couple. I began cautiously. "Hi, Megan. How are you?" He tried to sound casual. "Hi, Michael, everything's great. And you?" she replied. "It's not like anything either. Listen, is Jessica okay? She's been looking tired lately." He tried to approach from a distance. "Tired?" "Well, she talked a little about stress at work." Megan hesitated. "But overall she didn't say anything about any problems." Megan's response was vague, but I sensed she was hiding something. Her tone was too neutral to not be suspicious. I thanked her for the conversation, but I realized I couldn't count on her. If Jessica was hiding something, Megan probably knew, but wouldn't tell. I began to feel drawn to more drastic action. That evening, while Jessica was in the shower, I decided to check her bag. I didn't feel like doing it, but my intuition literally screamed that I would find something important. And I did. In the side pocket of her bag was a restaurant receipt. The date was the same day she worked late. The receipt listed 2 main courses and a bottle of wine. I sat holding the scrap of paper and felt a wave of anger and frustration rise inside me. When Jessica came out of the shower, I tried to stay calm. how was your day?" I asked. She said nothing special had happened, though there was a shadow in her eyes. I put the conversation aside, figuring that without more evidence she would just find a way to get away with it. The next morning I started to take action more seriously. I installed a GPS tracker in her car. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but I needed to know the truth. I couldn't live with this uncertainty any longer. When she left that evening, saying she was meeting a friend, I opened the app on my phone and saw her car parked in a residential area on the other side of town. This wasn't Megan's place or any of the other friends I knew of. Holding my breath, I decided to drive there. I parked a distance away so as not to arouse suspicion. Her car was parked on the side of the road, and a few meters away was a small cafe. And that's where I saw her. Jessica was sitting at a table by the window with her husband. I couldn't see his face, but he was tall and wearing a light-colored shirt. They were talking and laughing, and when he touched her hand, she didn't pull it away. I felt my heart clench. Anger and pain fought inside me. I stayed in the car, my eyes fixed on that table. When they got out, he walked her to the car, and I clearly saw them hug. It wasn't a friendly hug. That night I returned home devastated. Now I knew the truth, but I still didn't know how to deal with it. To keep myself from going crazy, I began to delve into memories of how Jessica and I met. These thoughts brought a little warmth to my soul, even if there was bitterness underneath. We met at a coffee shop near the hospital, where I often stopped on my way home from night shifts. She was standing in line, looking at something on her phone, and I, as usual, ordered a latte from the machine. When the barista handed her a cup, Jessica accidentally touched it.
Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Thank you.
The hot coffee spilled onto the counter, and she began to apologize, blushing. "Don't worry, it's even refreshing after another shift," I joked. She laughed, and it was that smile of hers that won me over at the time. We talked all morning, even though I was supposed to be going to bed after my night shift. Her lightness and humor made me forget about my fatigue. A week later, we were drinking coffee together regularly, and I realized that she was the person who could fill all the gaps in my life. Now, sitting at home in the kitchen, I wondered where that feeling of her being the world to me had gone. She had changed, that much was clear. But hadn't I changed too? Maybe my constant work in intensive care, my evening shifts, and endless conversations about work had pushed her away too? I didn't want to believe that everything we had built together could just disappear so easily. Jessica came into the kitchen, interrupting my thoughts. She looked gorgeous in her favorite wine-colored dress, even though we didn't have anything special planned for the evening. "Are you serious?" she asked, leaning down to put her arm around my shoulders. Her warm arms almost melted my suspicion, but only for a moment. "I'm thinking about work," I lied. She smiled. "I was just thinking, we haven't spent any time together in a while. How about dinner at your favorite place?" It was unexpected, but I couldn't help but agree. Her mood had changed, she seemed happy and somehow more open. But something still bothered me. I asked myself, was this her attempt to turn things around, or was it just a game of catch-up? During dinner, Jessica was as warm and cheerful as ever. She talked about her plans for a new project and how she wanted to take cooking lessons. We even laughed and the waiter accidentally mixed up our orders. In those moments, I almost forgot about everything that had been happening lately. But when we got home, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and quickly turned off the sound. "It's just Megan," she said, but she didn't rush to answer. I noticed her hand tremble a little as she set the phone down on the nightstand. She quickly went to sleep after that, and I was left sitting on the edge of the bed. What was this? Her attempt to strengthen our relationship or to disguise something else? Her warmth that evening was so genuine, but the secrets she was clearly hiding were keeping me from relaxing. I realized that this game would continue until I could find the answers. But tonight I allowed myself to believe that maybe something could still be salvaged. The next morning I woke up before Jessica. She was sleeping peacefully, her face looking so carefree that it was hard to imagine that there could be any lie behind it. But the peace didn't last long. Anxiety and suspicion filled my head again. I decided to act. I couldn't remain in the dark any longer, because every little thing was pushing me to one thought: Jessica was hiding something. She had gone to meet a friend that afternoon, leaving her laptop on the kitchen table. I hesitated for a long time, but finally opened it. There was no password on the laptop, and I felt my heart beat faster when I saw the work chat open. At first, everything seemed normal: discussions of designs, deadlines, edits. But then I noticed one name: Steve. Steve left her a few messages that she didn't have time to respond to. Their tone was a little too personal. "How's your morning, beautiful? Still thinking about our last meeting? You're amazing." I tried to compose myself and breathe evenly, even though everything inside was on fire. In my browser history, I saw several requests for restaurant reservations, as well as a hotel reservation for the past month. The name of the hotel was familiar. It was the same hotel I had seen her car next to the day she was delayed at work. A wave of anger was consuming me, but I held it back. I closed my laptop, put it back in its place, and sat down at the kitchen table. What now? Confrontation? Do I need more evidence? Everything was still too vague, although each piece of the puzzle was gradually falling into place. When Jessica returned, I tried to look calm. She was in a good mood, brought me my favorite coffee, and smiled as if everything was okay between us. But I couldn't see her in the same light anymore. "How was your meeting with Megan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Great," she replied, pouring coffee into cups. "We laughed a lot, reminiscing about our college days." I nodded and pretended to be interested. But this time I felt like every word she said was hiding something more. For the next few days I couldn't find peace. My suspicions forced me to act again. One evening, while she was in the bathroom, I checked her phone again. This time I found a few WhatsApp messages from Steve that she seemed to have forgotten to delete. "I miss you. When's the next time?" I took screenshots, sent them to my email, and closed the app. I had no choice. Now I had not only guesses, but also proof. The next morning I said nothing to her again. But I knew the time was coming when I could no longer keep quiet. Her secrets hung between us like storm clouds about to explode. And this time, when the truth came out, everything would change.
Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Thank you.
The holidays have always been a special time for Jessica and me. We both love the atmosphere of Christmas, the twinkling lights, the smell of the tree, the tradition of exchanging gifts by the fireplace. But this year, something felt off. The atmosphere in our home seemed tense, even when we were decorating the tree or picking out presents together. I tried to pretend that everything was fine, and even gave Jessica a new bracelet, the exact one she had once accidentally mentioned in a store. Her response was warm. She hugged me and whispered that she loved me. But the words rang hollow. They lacked the sincerity I had been used to feeling before. As Christmas approached, I began to notice Jessica staying late at work more often. "The holidays are always chaotic," she explained. But that didn't reassure me. Every time she said she was staying longer, a suspicion flashed through my mind. One day, on Christmas Eve, we were shopping for presents together. I noticed her phone light up in her pocket. A message. She glanced at the screen and quickly muted it without even checking who had written. The gesture was too bold to ignore. "Who is this?" I asked cautiously, trying to keep my voice calm. "Oh, it's just the boss," she replied, not even looking in my direction. He asked me to help with the last documents before the holidays. Her tone was casual, but the name itself had me wary. Her boss, Richard, was a man with a strong personality but surprisingly friendly. I had met him a few times at corporate events. He was about my age, but twice as confident. I had never suspected he might be a problem. Until now. Jessica had always spoken of him with respect, and sometimes even joked that Richard is an example of a true leader. But now I suddenly remembered how she had once enthusiastically described how he had solved a difficult problem at work, and how her eyes had lit up at that time. This picture was perceived completely differently now. I had to work the night shift on Christmas. It was a common practice, and Jessica always supported me in doing so. But this year she seemed even glad that I wouldn't be home. "Don't worry, honey," she said when I told her about the change. "I'm just going to watch a few movies and get some rest." This bothered me a little, because before she always offered to cook something festive, even if we were supposed to celebrate separately. Now her indifference only increased my suspicions. A scenario began to form in my head that I didn't want to accept. Maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe Richard really was just a good manager trying to get everything done before the holidays. But my intuition told me otherwise. The night before my shift, I went to bed early, hoping to rest up before a hard day at work. But during the night, I woke up to lights streaming into the room. Jessica was sitting on the edge of the bed, texting someone. Her face was lit up by the screen of her phone, her expression tense but excited. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep. This was the final sign. Something was definitely happening, and I could no longer ignore it. The change at Christmas would be a crucial test for me. I already knew what I had to do. Christmas Eve. The hospital was unusually quiet, even in the intensive care unit. There were fewer patients than usual, and work was moving along smoothly. But I couldn't concentrate. Thoughts of Jessica and our relationship kept coming back. Her recent actions and behavior, hiding her phone, being late, all of it was unsettling. I was supposed to work the night shift on Christmas Day, but I decided to leave early. My coworker Jeff was happy to cover for me so I could arrange something for my wife. I left the hospital thinking I would go home to confirm my suspicions, or maybe finally get some peace of mind. As I parked near the house, I immediately noticed something was wrong. There was a strange car parked in our driveway, a dark sedan that looked familiar. At first, I couldn't remember where I'd seen it, but my heart was already pounding. I entered the house. In the hallway, right by the entrance, were men's shoes. Big, black, expensive. I crouched down to take a closer look, and my heart sank. They were the shoes of my boss, Dr. William Rains. Then I acted automatically, as if in a fog. The living room was dimly lit, an empty bottle of wine on the table, her glass still half full. On the floor lay her dress, the one I had seen her wearing that morning. I walked over to the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. I could hear soft voices coming from inside, Jessica's familiar laugh and my boss's low voice. I cautiously peeked inside. What I saw left me speechless. My wife was lying on the bed, wrapped in a blanket, and Rains was sitting next to her, relaxed, with that confident smile I knew so well from work. He had a glass of wine in his hands, and his jacket was lying on the floor next to the bed. They didn't even notice me. The floor creaked under my foot, and they both turned their heads in my direction. Jessica's face filled with horror when she saw me. Rains, on the other hand, looked unfazed. He slowly set his glass down on the floor and stood up as if it were just another normal workday. "Michael, Jessica started to say something, but I stopped her with a raised hand. "You, with him?" I asked, barely able to contain myself. She didn't answer, just looked down. Rains looked at me and said coldly, "Michael, I can explain this." "Don't you dare," I interrupted, feeling anger welling up inside me. You did this in my house. In my bed. I turned and walked towards the exit, not wanting to hear another word. Jessica rushed after me, but I didn't even look at her. Michael, wait, please, she called, but her voice was empty to me. This night was supposed to be a celebration, but it became the end of everything I believed in. I stepped out into the cold night, closing the door behind me. The icy air hit my face sharply, but I barely felt the cold. Inside, chaos reigned. The Christmas lights on the neighboring houses twinkled, a reminder of a holiday that was now ruined forever. I leaned against the hood of my car, taking deep breaths to calm myself. Jessica was left at home with him. My boss. The man I respected, trusted, and who made all the important decisions at work. And now, like some predator, he had brazenly invaded my life, taking away what I held sacred. The door opened and Jessica ran out, her coat wrapped around her. Her eyes were red and her face tense. She moved closer, but I raised my hand, stopping her halfway. Michael, please let me explain. Her voice trembled, but I had no desire left to listen to excuses. What's there to explain? I replied coldly, feeling my voice crack with rage. You cheated on me. With my boss. In our house. In our bed. She lowered her eyes, but didn't take a single step back.
Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Thank you.
She seemed to have gathered all her strength to face me. It didn't happen the way you think. She began, but I interrupted her. Oh, really? Then explain. I'm all ears. She fell silent. The words caught somewhere in her throat, and the silence was worse than any excuse. Finally, she said quietly. It started a few months ago. The words pierced me like a knife. I turned away to avoid looking at her. My hands clenched into fists, and I took a few steps along the side of the car, trying to gather my thoughts. A few months? I repeated. And you didn't even think to tell me? Give me a chance to realize something was wrong? She raised her head. Her eyes were shining with tears. I wanted to. But I didn't know how. Oh, you knew how to hide it, my sarcastic comment came out. You knew how to make up all these work meetings and delays. How to pretend that everything was fine between us. Her voice cracked as she said. I didn't mean for it to come to this. But you allowed it, I interrupted her again. Why? What did I do wrong? She shook her head. You didn't do anything. It wasn't your fault, Michael. It was my fault. Those words only added to the pain. Because of me. How easy it is to say that, to shift responsibility but not explain anything. Because of you? I snapped. You had a choice. You always had a choice, Jessica. I felt lonely, she finally cried out, her voice breaking. You were always at work, and I was here, alone. It was unfair. I worked night and day to provide for us so we could plan our future. And now it was being used as an excuse for her betrayal. And that's why you decided to found a company? I could barely contain my anger. With my boss? Why him? She was silent, swallowing back tears. But I knew the answer. He was confident, charismatic, with great authority. Jessica must have seen in him something that I couldn't give because of my constant shifts and fatigue. But that didn't excuse her actions. Michael, she began quietly, it was a mistake. But I still love you. I laughed. Bitterly, coldly, without real laughter. Do you love me? I repeated. Is this your love? A lie, a betrayal? I leave you with him in our house, and you say you love me? She couldn't answer. Tears were streaming down her face, but it didn't matter anymore. At that moment, the door of the house opened and Rains appeared on the threshold. He looked confident as always, but there was a shadow of concern in his gaze. "Michael," he said quietly, "maybe we should talk." I looked at him and felt nothing but cold determination. "You've said enough," I replied. I got in the car, closed the door, and started the engine. Jessica ran to the door, but I didn't look at her. That night was the end of everything I had ever thought was real. As I drove away, I saw her in the mirror standing in the cold, her hands clasped over her face. But I couldn't let myself feel sorry for her anymore. The pity had already destroyed me. Now all that was left was to start over. I drove back to the empty hospital parking lot. The car sat in the dim light of the streetlight, and my mind was filled with thoughts. My life was falling apart like a house of cards, and I didn't know what to do next. I just sat in the car, feeling the anger and pain give way to emptiness. Christmas shifts at the hospital were always tough, but tonight everything felt foreign. Usually I found peace in my work, it was my protection from the world. But now even that protection seemed unnecessary. Colleagues passed by, nodding, and I avoided their gazes. In the common room, I opened a locker, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. Outside, it was quiet, snow was falling in even flakes, covering the city with a blanket of white. People were celebrating at home with their families, and I was left alone with my pain. After a few minutes of silence, I realized that I couldn't stay here. My frustration and anger were preventing me from doing my job calmly. I went up to the head nurse and asked permission to leave early. She looked at me with concern, but didn't ask. I'm sure she saw something in my eyes, but I didn't have the energy to explain right now. Back in the car, I got back behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine. I just stared at the steering wheel, gripping it until my fingers turned white. My mind was torn between memories and the present. Every little thing that had seemed innocent before now raised doubts. How many times had I come home late from a shift, thinking Jessica was already asleep? How many times had I noticed her strange behavior but chalked it up to stress? And now it was all obvious, all her lateness at work, the obvious glances at her phone, the hidden smiles. The feeling of defeat was total. Not just because of her betrayal, but because I didn't notice anything. I had built my life around her, and she had chosen someone else. And it wasn't just someone, but someone I respected, someone I trusted. I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. Jessica's number was there, as always. My hand hovered over the screen. What could I say? I'd already said everything I needed to. Words wouldn't change what had happened. They couldn't bring back what had been lost. Instead, I scrolled to another contact, my friend Jake. We hadn't been in touch much lately because of my shift, but he was always the person I could turn to when times were tough. I wrote a quick message, I need some advice. Can I meet up? The answer came almost immediately, of course. Where are you? I took one last look at the hospital, started the car, and headed to the bar where we had often met before. It was a place I felt comfortable in, a place that associated with ease and carefreeness. I needed at least a sip of this. The bar was almost empty. Christmas had left behind only a few lonely customers and the soft sound of holiday tunes coming from the speakers. I saw Jake at a table in the corner. He stood up as I approached and gave me a big hug. What happened? He asked as we sat down. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and showed him the photos I had saved from Jessica's phone, the messages from Rains. Then I told him everything, how I had seen the car, how I had found them together, how I had heard her confession. Jake was silent while I spoke. When I finished, he put his glass aside and looked at me directly. Michael, it's not your fault. Don't let her make you believe it is. His words brought me a small sense of relief, but the pain remained. We talked for a long time, and during that time I realized one thing, everything that happened that night had changed me forever. Jessica betrayed me, but it wasn't the end of my life. It was just the end of our story.
Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Thank you.
I got home in the early hours of the morning. The house was dark, and her car was gone. There was a note on the kitchen table. Michael, I know I made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry. I'm packing my things and going to Megan's for now. I hope you can forgive me someday. I still love you. Jay. I stared at that piece of paper for a long time, but I felt nothing but tiredness. Then I just crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. Now it was up to me. The next few days after that night passed in strange silence. The house felt empty, though little had physically changed. Her belongings were gone, but the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, like a last reminder that there had once been love here. Or at least what I thought was love. I decided to take a few days off. Work had always been my refuge, but now even it couldn't fill the hole Jessica had left. I spent a lot of time in those days sitting in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee, staring at the Christmas tree that still glowed in the corner of the living room. Its light seemed like a mockery, a reminder of the holiday I had lost. The phone rang a few times, but I ignored the calls. A couple of times it was her. Her name would pop up on the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Then there were calls from friends who must have heard something. Even Jeff, my coworker, texted. Michael, I heard you took a vacation. Are you okay? I didn't answer. What could I say? That my life had been turned upside down? That the man I considered a friend and a leader had crossed the worst line? That now even my workplace was a battlefield I didn't want to return to? On the fourth day of my loneliness, I decided to leave the house. It wasn't a decision that came easily, but sitting between empty walls only exacerbated my pain. I went to a cafe that Jessica and I used to love. There was a smell of fresh pastries and coffee there, which used to bring warmth, but this time it only intensified the feeling of loss. I sat down at a corner table, ordered an espresso, and tried to think about something else. But as soon as the cup touched my lips, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was him. Rains. He looked the same as always, in a spotless suit, with a confident expression on his face. He didn't even stop when he saw me, but walked up to the bar, ordered a coffee, and only then turned his head. Michael, he said in a calm voice, stepping closer. I didn't answer. I just stared at him, feeling the same anger welling up inside me that I had that night. We need to talk, he continued, sitting down across from me. His tone was professional, as if this were just another hospital appointment. I don't think there's anything to discuss here, I replied coldly, putting my cup down. He paused, looking me straight in the eye. I know what I did. And I understand it's unforgivable. But I don't want it to affect your career. His words sent a wave of indignation through me. Did he really think I was worried about my career right now? What could he offer as some form of compensation? You're ruining my life, and now you want to play noble? I couldn't hold back my sarcasm. He sighed and reached for his cup, but changed his mind. Michael, I made a mistake. A huge one. I don't know how to fix it. I leaned closer, my elbows on the table. You can't fix this, Rains. This isn't a work project. This is my life. We sat in silence until he stood up. If you decide to return to work, know that I will not let this affect your position. I didn't answer. He stood there for a few more seconds, then left. I sat at the table, watching him disappear through the door, and I realized, I didn't know if I would ever be able to go back to work. If I would ever be able to even look at him every day. But one thing was clear, this was a battle I wasn't going to lose again. After that meeting with Rains at the cafe, I came home and felt a wave of fatigue wash over me. But it wasn't just physical fatigue now, it was something deeper, almost like an inner despair. I knew I was at a crossroads. Everything I had built, at home and at work, had been destroyed, and I didn't know how to start over. The days became routine. I would get up, make myself breakfast, try to read books or watch TV, but nothing would hold my attention. The room still echoed with her presence. One of her scarves remained in the closet, forgotten in the rush. Its smell was a sign of a past I no longer wanted to remember. I started running. For the first time in a long time, I put on my old sneakers and went for a morning run. The cold air burned my lungs, but it was exactly what I needed. Running helped me vent my anger and distract myself from the thoughts that were bothering me. Every step on the snowy sidewalk was like another push forward, away from the pain that was paralyzing me. A few days after the runs, I decided to do other things. I cleaned the house for the first time in months, removing everything that reminded me of her. Her scarf, an empty bottle of perfume, even old photos from our first trip to the beach, they all went into a box I had stashed in the attic. I didn't have the strength to throw her away forever, but I knew she didn't have to be a part of my life anymore. I still hadn't shown up at the hospital. My colleagues started texting me more often, asking when I would be back. Jeff even offered to meet up, but I politely declined. I wasn't ready to explain what had happened to anyone yet.
Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Thank you.
This was my battle, and I wanted to fight it alone. At some point, I decided to see a therapist. It was a difficult decision, but I knew I needed help. At the first meeting, I could barely articulate everything that was building up in my head. But the therapist didn't interrupt me, he just listened. It was an unexpected relief to know that someone else was willing to understand what I was going through. After a few sessions, I slowly began to pick up the pieces of myself. My therapist helped me see that I wasn't to blame for what happened. Being cheated on is the person's decision, not your fault, he said in one session. And those words began to echo in my mind, gradually strengthening me. One morning I knew it was time to go back to the hospital. I didn't know what it would be like to see Rains again, or if I would even be able to look him in the eye. But I also knew that letting him control not only my work but my life would be a mistake. This was my space, my calling, and I wasn't going to lose that. The first day I showed up at work, I could feel the tension in the air. My colleagues spoke to me cautiously, as if they knew what had happened but didn't want to ask questions. Rains wasn't in the office, which gave me time to adjust. I threw myself into my work, remembering that every person I saved was what I came here for. Late in the evening, as the shift was coming to an end, I heard a familiar voice behind me. It was Rains. He came and stood at a distance, as if not daring to speak. I turned around, looked him in the eye, but said nothing. Then I returned to the monitor, paying no further attention to him. That was my first small victory. I didn't know where this path would lead me yet. But now I was ready to fight for my life, without her, without him, but with myself. My first week back in the hospital was a blur. I was completely absorbed in my work, and I was grateful for it. The patients, the medical calls, the constant hum of machines, all of it helped to keep my thoughts of Jessica and Rains at bay. But I couldn't escape reality for long. On one of my morning shifts, as I was just entering my office, I saw an envelope on my desk. At first I thought it was some kind of regular internal document, but when I opened it, I felt the blood rush to my face. Inside was a short message. Michael, I know I can't fix what happened, but I'm stepping down. This is my decision, and I ask that you not take it back. I wish you nothing but the best. Rains. I reread it several times, not believing my eyes. He left. All my ideas about how our further meetings would turn out turned out to be nothing. And although this should have brought relief, in fact I felt an emptiness. He chose the easy way out, leaving me the battlefield. Colleagues began discussing the news as soon as word got out that Rains was leaving his position. Rumors spread quickly, but no one knew the reason. I was asked several times if I had heard anything, but I just shrugged every time. Without him, everything at the hospital had changed. He was replaced by a new manager, Dr. Martin, who seemed to be the complete opposite of Rains. He was calm, considerate of everyone, and it was much easier to work under his leadership. It seemed like everything was finally starting to fall into place. But my personal life was still in chaos. Jessica no longer called, texted, or tried to contact me. Her silence was like a balm to the wound, but it also left many questions. What was she doing now? Did she regret what had happened? Or was her life moving forward just as quickly as mine? To find answers, I started spending more time with my friends. Jake stayed close by, constantly suggesting we go out for a beer or just to chat. One evening, sitting in a small pub, we started talking about the future. "What were you thinking about doing next?" he asked, taking a sip of his glass. I thought about it. My whole life for the past few years had been built around Jessica, our plans, our home. Now it was all falling apart. But it also opened up new possibilities. "I think I'll try something new," I replied. "I've always wanted to travel, see the world. Maybe it's time to do it." Jake smiled. "That sounds like a plan. But first you have to give yourself time. You're just starting to come to your senses." His words were right. I really didn't know if I was ready for any big changes, but the idea of seeing the world, of breaking out of this vicious circle, seemed tempting. The next morning, as I sat in my apartment, thoughts of traveling kept coming to mind. I opened my laptop and started searching for options. Somewhere deep down, I knew this was more than just an escape. This was a chance to start over. When I found a tour to South America, my heart filled with excitement for the first time in weeks. I didn't hesitate. I booked my ticket, closed my laptop, and looked out the window. The snow was still falling, but now I saw not cold and emptiness, but a new beginning. The decision was made. My life would no longer depend on the person who betrayed me or broke my heart. From now on, it would depend only on me. It's been 6 months since my life was turned upside down. During that time, I've traveled to South America, seen sunrises over the Amazon, climbed Machu Picchu, and even tried surfing off the coast of Chile.
Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Thank you.
Traveling has not only broadened my horizons, but also given me the opportunity to rethink everything that happened. When I returned home, I felt like a completely different person. I returned to work, where things had become much calmer over time. The new manager created a friendly atmosphere, and even the tension that had remained after Rain's betrayal had disappeared. I began to feel like I was in control of my life again. But as it turned out, one meeting was to change everything. It was a typical spring evening. I decided to go to a coffee shop after work that Jessica and I used to frequent. I didn't think of it as some kind of symbolic gesture, I just wanted to have coffee in a familiar place. I was standing in line when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Michael?" I turned and saw her. Jessica. She looked a little different than I remembered. Her hair was shorter, and there was a deep sadness in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. She was looking at me with an expression of indecision, as if she was afraid I would turn around and leave without saying a word. "Hi, Jessica," I replied calmly, although my heart was beating faster. I don't even know what to say," she admitted, lowering her eyes. "Can I sit with you?" My first instinct was to refuse, but something in her voice made me nod. We found a table in the corner and sat down. She spoke first. She told me how she had spent months trying to come to terms with what she had done. How she had been seeing a therapist, trying to understand why she had made that terrible choice. She even admitted that she had lost her job and had been struggling to find herself for a long time. "Michael," she said finally, looking me in the eye, "I know I lost you. But I want you to know, I'm so sorry." I listened to her, and with each word I felt the heavy stone I carried in my soul begin to melt. I had not expected this meeting, but strangely enough, it did not cause me anger or pain. Instead, I felt that the past no longer held me in its grip. "I've been thinking about us a lot, too," I finally said. "And I've realized that we all make mistakes. But I don't hold a grudge against you anymore, Jessica." She nodded, a faint smile appearing on her face. You have no idea how important it was to hear that. We talked for a long time. And although it was only the beginning of a new chapter, I knew that this meeting was necessary. Jessica looked sincere, and for the first time in a long time I saw in her eyes the same warmth that had once made me fall in love. We sat at a table in a coffee shop, and everything around us seemed to disappear. People walked by, laughter and the clink of cups were the background sounds, but all I could see was her. Jessica. The same woman I had once loved with all my heart. And, I now understood, my love for her had not completely disappeared, despite everything that had happened. Our conversation in the coffee shop was anything but ordinary. Jessica talked about her mistakes, the pain she felt after our breakup, her attempts to understand herself. Her words were sincere, and I sensed neither excuses nor manipulation in them, only openness and remorse. "I know I probably don't even deserve this conversation," she said, clenching her hands until her fingers turned white. "But I wanted to try. I wanted to say that if I could turn back time, things would be different." I looked at her and realized that I had come a long way myself. The pain of the past no longer gripped me, and the thoughts of her betrayal now seemed less overwhelming. My travels, my reflections, even her absence, all of this helped me understand that forgiveness is not weakness. It is necessary to move forward, whether together or apart. "Jessica," I began, after a few seconds of silence, "I don't know what's next. But I do know that you've always been an important part of my life. And maybe it's time to try to figure out if we can start over." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. "Are you sure?" she asked, barely holding back her emotions. I nodded. "We've both changed. And if we really want to try, it won't be a comeback, it'll be a new beginning." The next few weeks were a test for us. We didn't rush into a relationship. Instead, we both decided to take it slow, as if we were getting to know each other again. We spent time together, went for walks, talked for hours about what had changed in us over the past 6 months. Jessica was honest like never before. She didn't try to justify her mistakes, but instead showed how she was working on herself. I also opened up to her, telling her about what I had gone through to find myself. One evening, as we were walking in the park, she stopped and took my hand. "You know, Michael, I didn't expect you to be able to forgive me. But I want you to know, I will never betray your trust again." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hope welling up inside me. "I believe you, Jessica. And that's probably the most important thing." We continued our journey through the park, holding hands. It was not only a physical journey, but also a symbolic one, our first step together into a new life. We both knew there would be difficulties ahead, but now we were ready to overcome them together. The Christmas that had changed our lives so much 6 months earlier was a thing of the past. And the future now seemed brighter and full of possibilities.
Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Thank you.